Hey there, welcome. This is Derek McDaniel. So, today I'm just gonna talk to you guys a little bit about tariffs. Um, it's funny because this is a policy that has sort of been put to bed, retired. Like, generally, policymakers don't like tariffs, they don't favor them, and I think this is a good thing. But there are some things to discuss here, and um, apparently Trump has proposed tariffs. I haven't looked into the details of that, but the reason generally is industry protectionism. Like, want politically, it can be popular to help support certain domestic industries, and that is actually a legitimate benefit of tariffs. Like, even if the efficiencies of trade and specialization um, lead to a much larger uh, economic surplus for all of the system, that tends to get concentrated. So by keeping many different diverse industries robust and active, that has benefits for our domestic economy, for our re- emergency readiness, lots of different things like that. So tariffs can contribute to that positively, but I generally think there's better ways of doing that. Um, and that's debatable. The alternatives do have pros and cons as well. I would prefer to just see like policies that directly utilize um, critical domestic industries. Obviously, in MMT, we talk a lot about buffer stock policies. A simple example of which is like biblical story of Joseph storing up 7 years of grain. How do you think he stored that grain? It's going to be a tax, guys. Either a tax or he's issuing currency to allow people to redeem the grain. I mean, it's a little bit unclear historically how that played out, but that's the story. So, simple buffer stock policies are a good way to support industries to keep our domestic readiness high, um, to um, make resilient supply chains and um, reduce excessive consolidation, which can create risk. But today, I just want to talk about how the cost of tariffs. I mean, even though it's not necessarily great, the cost of tariffs, especially if they're small, aren't nearly as much as you would think. It's not like it completely destroys trade. So, what does the tariff do? So, you can either have a percentage cost applied to imports, or you can have a flat cost. So, um, you could do it with commodities or consumer goods. There's a lot of different options. But the point I want to make is for high value added items, for items like cars, computer chips, these things that really require a global supply chain to do well. Um, Other consumer goods like clothing and agriculture are much easier to produce domestically across a wide variety of countries. But when it comes to automobile manufacture and computers, smartphones, stuff like that, the complexity of the manufacturing process is such that global trade and is critical. But these tend to be higher value added items. So even if a tariff is adding a fixed percentage cost to those items, this represents a much smaller percentage of the consumer surplus. So, if you're familiar with supply and demand, which usually I don't like to use, but typically when that model is presented, this certain idea of consumer and producer surplus is explained if if it's presented well. So, what is a consumer and a producer surplus? So, that surplus is just going to be the difference between the limiting bid or the highest price you are willing to pay and the price you actually get it at. So if you're willing to pay $1,000 for something, but you can buy it for $100, then your consumer surplus is going to be $900. Now, often this is going to be described in the context of an individual business. So, like, if you're just looking at one, like, producer, like a bike company, a car company, or such, because there are alternatives, the consumer surplus will appear small, right? So if I can get a bike for $300 from one company and $500 from another, then I'm like, I'm not gonna want to pay more than 500 for this other one. So that sort of limits the amount of consumer surplus. But if you're trying to choose between, okay, if this was my only option for this particular item, so if it was either buy this or not have it at all, that's gonna look a little different in how that's gonna measure a consumer surplus. So with tariffs, like if you have an item that costs $100 but you're willing to pay $1,000, then a 25% tariff is going to be just a small percentage of that $900 consumer surplus. And in some cases, producers may actually cut, if there's a tariff, then uh, manufacturers exporting to the US may actually cut their prices so they're more competitive. So even if the tariff is like 25%, the price may only go up by 20% or 12%, or even if it's a high margin product in a competitive market, the exporters might just take the hit, just keep it at the same price and absorb the cost of the tariffs themselves. So even with tariffs, it's not clear what the price impact is going to be. And I just want to quickly comment that so there are a lot of items that are low value added items like cheap Chinese goods, like just toys, and not that toys aren't useful or beneficial, but just low quality stuff that can be mass produced and is disposable, fast fashion, all these things. So in that case, a tariff is going to have very little downside, um, and potentially a pretty good upside, because what it'll do is it'll allow you to domestically um, do those same processes. So for some goods, the benefits of a global supply chain are much less, like textiles, agriculture. Uh, I mean, with bicycles, it's sort of in the middle. They're in a middle ground of complexity. It helps to have global supply to a certain extent. Frame building is a complex task, and to be able to mass produce good bike frames affordably, it's hard. It's hard to mass produce good bike frames affordably. So there is a real benefit with bicycles for global supply chains. So I mean, tariffs are a sort of mixed bag. They definitely aren't a disaster for the economy, because I think the issue people are missing is that it's about your standard of living, right? So if producing goods is the limiting factor in your standard of living, then yeah, tariffs are going to be problematic. But I don't think that's really the case in the modern world, since like 20 years after World War II. Like, producing consumer goods has not been really an important factor in limiting quality of life and living standards. Um, Now, obviously, living standards have improved as we have gotten better at those processes, but um, I think there's a lot of room for flexibility in terms of consumer goods. Less so in areas like housing and these other things. So for most people, just having good employment locally is going to be the most important factor in their quality of life. Not if they can get like cheaper goods. Um, and there are particular goods that are critical, like cars and I would say cars and it's hard to say other than cars, but certain tools maybe. I don't know. And obviously, oil, global supply chain for oil is important. It's strategic. Um, that's oil's an unusual good in that respect. In that the global supply chain is important, and even though um, domestic production is usually important as well. Whereas with these more complex goods, um, you just can't have domestic production at a reasonable cost point um, for most countries. You know, like the United States is big enough, like we can manufacture cars now. It's hard for us to have the same um, qual- quality offerings across like the U.S. is good at. From what I understand about cars, I'm not the biggest car expert. We're good at making big cars like trucks, vans, SUVs. So we make. It's my understanding we make pretty good quality vehicles in that scope. But like obviously, Japanese car manufacturers have a great track record for building small, cheap, really efficient vehicles, which is really important for like your um, just like working class, like entry level labor market. You want those kind of vehicles to be readily available, to be high quality, to be good. So for trades and um, lots of different industries, commercial vehicles, you may have more specific needs, but a lot of people just need a vehicle to be able to get to work. And um, the way our economy is structured, having a vehicle is one of the biggest factors in improving your quality of life because it just dramatically increases the amount of jobs that are available to you and your career mobility is going to be hugely affected by access to a vehicle, um, by reliable vehicular transportation. Now, I think we definitely want public transit and these things, but realistically, a vehicle is always going to have greater value in, in for a worker in terms of commuting. So I love public transit and cycling for all sorts of applications. Even for commuting, it's nice, but I don't think it's realistic for most people over most for all of their career. Like at a certain point in your career, if you want to have a job that is competitive, that will be able to compensate you and pay you, um, if you want to have an advance in your career and build, improve your quality of life and your income, you're probably going to need a vehicle to commute. That's just realistic, unless you live in a big city like San Francisco, New York, maybe even Denver or Salt Lake City. I don't know. the The principal issue is actually that housing costs tend to be way too high in big cities. So, I mean, that would be another way of addressing much of this issue. Um, and it's it's hard to move close to a job. It's much easier to find a new job than to find a new place to live. At least for entry level jobs. But anyway, I think this is an important issue, and definitely vehicles are a critical part of our economy, and that is where tariffs are going to hit. Like, so if you made an exception for vehicles and maybe like steel and oil, if you took those three things out of a tariff, I don't think a tariff would be that bad. Um, Now, I think you should still have it on computers. It's going to make computers a bit more expensive, but honestly, the best way to get affordable computers is to look at the used market, just to have high quality stuff that's maintainable. And having tariffs won't, if anything, it'll actually encourage production of higher quality because someone's like, oh, if I'm already spending this much, I want something that'll last. I want something that's good. Now, that's not a given. There's a lot of complex factors in how companies make um, computing products, and that there's been a long trend of making stuff disposable and infringing on right to repair, planned obsolescence. So we need to take direct measures to try to combat those very negative trade practices, planned obsolescence. I mean, not everything needs to be designed to last forever, but I just think transparency is important, and issues like right to repair will make things important. But it's actually quite interesting the way this simple issue of tariffs, um, it affects a lot more you might than might be obvious initially. It affects these issues like right to repair, consumer goods, consumer rights, all kinds of FTC issues and such. So, just my thoughts. I wanted to weigh in on that. And yeah, have a good week, everybody. That's going to be it.